Chapter 41. Changes. Ronin noticed himself standing inside a dark space. This place. It felt familiar somehow. Using every sense he had, now muffled by the surrounding darkness, he reached out as he attempted to orient himself. Isn't this the place I entered when my apartment blew up? When I blacked out? He felt it then. There was something else there with him. A presence he'd felt before. Such a weak soul. The presence spoke, and the world itself shuddered. Ronin felt as if his mind was tearing itself apart, every word boring into him, seeking to prove themselves true. Why am I here? Ronin thought as he struggled against the pressure. The question rippled out, almost undetectable amidst the roiling waves. But something did listen. Something did respond. The chains of fate forge purpose, yet chains are not enough. The ladder of ascension demands inspiration. As reality itself boomed, the realm of nothingness twisted into something real, and in place of vast blackness, mountains of corpses rose. Below the inky black sky, the bony mounds continued up, growing larger until what remained of the sky above became little more than a tiny window. Why do they look so similar? Ronin thought in horror. These mountains of death were just like the ones he'd seen in Spectre's lair. The only difference here was in size. These were larger, much larger. Before he could come to grips with what was happening, he felt something pull him under. Dragged into the mountain of bones, Ronin sank deeper and deeper. Above, below, all around him, the corpses pressed in. He couldn't breathe. Whispers of despair, pleading, and hate next began to tear at him from within the depths, and he felt himself weakening. He was drowning. Realization struck him then. I'm dying. I'm really dying, aren't I? As a force began to pull at the very essence that made him, Ronin felt his own sense of individuality begin to disperse. Something new and foreign started to bore its way in, and the very idea of who he was began to twist. There were so many voices, so much hatred. Am I being replaced? As the icy amalgamation of alien hate filled him, Ronin grit his teeth, then roared, "No, I won't let it end like this." His battle soul activated as he rose up against the ambient will. He still had a lot of himself left, and he'd be damned if he was going to let his mind get stolen away and replaced by these voices. He strained his mind, stretching it into new positions as he tried to wrestle for control. It felt as if he'd entered a sort of high-level mental jiu-jitsu match. The only issue was, he knew none of the moves, but Ronin wasn't a stranger to learning mid-battle. Utilizing the lessons he'd learned from glory in the arena, he began to adapt. When he lost, he studied how, then changed his approach. When he won out, or found something that worked better, no matter how small the change, he memorized how, then applied the newly gained knowledge when possible. Most of the time, Ronin felt parts of himself turn. As if infected by a virus, his own mind twisted into the ambient will's allegiance, then promptly began to work against him. But sometimes, he did manage to win. As time passed, the mental war continued. It felt endless. Eventually, time disappeared, and thoughts faded. All that was left was the desperation born from the need to continue one's own existence. Then, something changed. Ronin began to win. Taking back more and more of what he'd lost, he eventually gained back everything around him. However, it wasn't enough. His very being had at one point ended up so scattered, it was now impossible to fully piece himself together. He would need replacements. twisting his very essence into the alien awareness, Ronin infected it back, then tore out parts of its own individuality. He next used his will as he would a hammer, molding the new awareness into something that would fit, then forced it into himself. A feeling of wrongness followed, almost as if he was becoming less human with every part he pushed in. Finally, after what might have been an eternity, or no time at all, somehow, he was whole again. But he was different. He was Ronin Maximus, son of Holder Maximus and Xena Maximus. He was he human? Ronin's eyes flashed open. He was back at the factory. To his right, he spotted Simon's, and below, he saw his bed, now drenched in sweat. What's going on? What was that nightmare? No. Nightmare? Was it real? He shuddered as he thought about what had happened back there. The desperation he'd felt when fighting for his life. That couldn't have just been a dream, right? It had felt so real. Lately, he'd felt like he'd gotten some control over the alien artifact. He'd been making steady progress with both the Calvrakian embrace and the battle soul technique. He shouldn't be affected by the legacy's mental influence anymore. This dream, however, did he really know anything at all about the thing inside of him? In an attempt to calm himself, Ronin closed his eyes again and entered his mindscape. The walls, corridors, and halls of the massive spaceship that was his mental palace looked spotless, just like they had before. He checked on the alien energy. There wasn't that much of it around, and the barrier still held. His mental guardians should wait. As he focused on the figures at the edge of his mindscape, he noticed that some of them were different. Strange. The guardians he'd inherited from the alien were now bound by black strands. The inky black substance coiled around them, wrapping up arms, legs, and torsi. Ronin got the distinct impression that these guardians had become stronger. Why hadn't any of the guardians he'd created himself changed? And what was this black substance? Was this related to that nightmare somehow? He had some of the stained guardians come over, then merged with them, feeling a foreign sort of influence as he did. This feels similar to what I absorbed in that dream, Ronin thought. Whatever I absorbed in that place must be what's sticking to my guardians. He exited his mindscape and spotted Simons waddling his way over. "You all right there?" the big man asked. "You've been sleeping through 3 entire design sessions." Ronin checked the time. He'd been asleep for almost 50 hours. "Ugh, fought an alien yesterday," he groaned. "Good one," Simons laughed, giving Ronin a couple of hearty claps on the stomach. "More like you've caused another Happy Pearl incident. If you don't want to talk about it, just say so, all right? There's no need to lie." "If that was true, what are you doing so close to me?" "Ow, that's right," Simon said, feigning disgust as he covered his nose. "Just get back in shape quickly, all right? You really do look rather disheveled. My father always emphasizes the importance of grooming oneself properly. No matter where you are, you always need to." "How's the racing ship design going?" Ronin cut him off. "Huh? Oh, right. I've been doing some rerouting on the Illuvian's power supply. It would help a lot if you could take a look at it." "All right," Ronin tiredly nodded back. "I'll just have to check on a few things first." He nudged his implant, then did a quick scan of his body. Yeah, in addition to a fractured collarbone and several bruised ribs, he also had a number of internal injuries. What truly had him baffled, though, was his height. He was now 176 centimeters tall, a whole 2 centimeters taller than he'd been before. It wasn't much, but still, he'd supposedly stopped growing years ago. For him to suddenly shoot up 2 centimeters. This It would appear more than just his mind had changed as he slept. So, when do you think you can take a look at it? Later today? Simons asked. Sorry, you were saying? The power supply. You really are tired, Simons breathed out. You shouldn't be pushing yourself so hard. Though you've been catching up to me fast in terms of design skills, it won't do you any good if you burn out before you reach your full potential. Worry about yourself instead, Ronin said. There's plenty of fuel left in this tank. He rose up, wobbled back and forth a few times before finding his balance, then shakily made his way towards the warehouse. Once he got to his disguise room, he looked into the mirror. This can't be good. What gazed back at him had a sunken-in face, deep-set eyes, and a body so spindly it could have just come out of Exodon. Even worse, his normally pale skin had now turned into a sickly, yellowish color. Simons had said he looked disheveled, but this went far beyond that. A sudden loud rumble rang out, and Ronin had to hold on to his stomach. He hadn't noticed it before, but now that he was aware of it, he felt a growing sense of hunger. He turned, then began to walk back towards the factory. Another loud rumble rang out. No, this is definitely not good at all. The hunger and thirst only seemed to grow with every step he made. Ronin's slow walk quickly transitioned into a jog, and by the time he reached the cantina, that jog had transformed into an all-out sprint. Food. I need food, now. He tore open a cabinet, then pulled out a bar of synth paste. Removing the wrapping, he wolfed down the bar, but it wasn't enough. He grabbed a couple of more bars, then bolted for the water dispenser. Bloody void of beginning, this is even worse than Exodon. Two hours later, a still gaunt but pot-bellied Ronin plomped into the VR chamber. He closed his eyes as he submerged into the liquid, and his surroundings transformed into the familiar-looking, Gothic-styled lobby. Whatever was going on with his body, he needed to save Scrabby first. He might have failed Elsa, but Scrabby still lived. There was still hope. Ronin plugged in the address he'd been sent by Sleeping Empress, then entered the Transhumanist Collective. Surprisingly, his 2 articles had already earned him 46 star coins. He'd only posted those things 2 days ago. What could have caused them to become so popular? Did his techniques work for people without an artifact? He looked down at the comments below the 2 posts. What's this? Taken aback, Ronin narrowed his eyes. Almost every single person who'd bought an article had left a comment, and they ranged from statements such as, "Embrace the demon," to glowing reviews expounding on how many people one would be able to kill with these techniques. Well, both Presenceless and the Calvrakian Embrace had certainly done something for the people here. That's for sure. It seemed the 2 techniques had done a whole lot more than they were supposed to, though, and not in a good way. People on this site normally didn't write like this. Torn between the potential damage his articles might be causing and his need for star coins, Ronin eventually bit the proverbial bullet and took the posts down. Though 46 star coins wasn't a large sum, it should at least be enough for now. He next looked for any information available on skinwalkers, but this was clearly the wrong site for that sort of stuff. The only posts he found about this were related to genetic editing and human skinwalker hybridization. Sigh. Though I have access to the quantum net, the lack of a web browser is going to make this impossible. A gaming capsule really isn't suited for this sort of stuff. Ronin sighed. The only reason he even had access to this site was due to Sleeping Empress. He rubbed his chin. Hadn't Dr. Leanna Furness said she'd used the quantum net? Perhaps she could help. He made an internal note to deal with this later. After a little more browsing, he bought a couple of articles on willpower and intuition-based abilities, then finished it off with an article on energy circulation. That last article seemed like it could relate to him. It essentially claimed that the human body consisted of nodes which could absorb energy, even showing several diagrams on how that energy could be circulated. Interestingly, the nodes it described were in the same place that the pressure points he'd learned from Thousand Palms were. The thing did seem to be legitimate. There was no mention of what this energy you were supposed to circulate was, though, nor were there any examples of people using it. Could the article be referring to the energy from the alien artifact? No, that was unlikely. Ronin was the only one with access to it, and a species generally evolved in response to an environment, not singular objects. If all of humanity had these nodes, the energy described in the technique must have been everywhere at one point. So, could the world have looked different before? Did humanity once have access to something that was now lost? Ronin shook his head, then exited VR. He lacked far too much information to begin postulating wild theories. As he emerged above the liquid, he nudged his uninet, then sent Dr. Leanna Furness a message. She was the only one left who could help him save Scrabby now, and it would probably cost him an arm and a leg, but a debt was a debt. He placed himself down on the grates, closed his eyes, then entered his mind palace. That last article had been the first real clue he'd found. If he could find a way to use it in the Potentia panorama, perhaps he could figure out what was happening to him. Chapter 42. Path of Creation. The Potentia panorama was not meant for humans, but it did deal with energy. There had to be a solution here somewhere, right? The question churned around in Ronin's head as he walked down one of the several corridors that comprised his mental palace. He reached the next gate, placed a hand on it, then leaned in. No, not this one either, he thought, then opened his eyes. He proceeded on to the next one. These sealed-off packets of memory, fused into the bulkhead, were still fairly small. About the size of a person, they were hundreds of times smaller than the major gates, to say nothing of his 9 great gates. He couldn't even begin to imagine how he'd be able to open those. Gate after gate was inspected, then promptly dismissed as he walked around. None of them seemed to match what he needed. Fortunately, with Ronin's mind having gotten stronger, there were at least more options to choose from now. He entered one of the many viewports of the Worldmaker, then crouched down to a gate fused into the observation deck. Oh, now we're talking. This one was different. Whatever packet of memory this gate held, it had something to do with circulation and channeling. He could feel it. He could open this gate too. It wasn't that large, but was it worth it? It could take a month to repair his mind palace again after this, and channeling wasn't exactly what he was looking for. Still, this was the closest he'd come yet. If this worked, he might actually be able to master the energy within him. If there's even a shadow of a chance, I'll have to take it, Ronin thought. He gathered his will, pushed with all he had, and the gate blew open as a rush of new memories came flooding in. The outline of a new technique began to form: meridian forging. To master the rules of reality, a warrior needs worthy meridians. This makes it possible to craft your own. No true warrior submits to inborn mediocrity. This allows one to forge one's own fate. As the inflow of memories stopped, Ronin closely inspected the technique. From the looks of it, A fusion of the alien artifact energy with his own flesh could create a new organ. That is, a channel. These channels were supposed to connect to all his other organs, as well as pressure points. But none of this knowledge was of any help. As always, there was no description of human physiology in the technique, just hundreds of different alien species. Good thing I found that article. Ronin chuckled to himself. The article from the Transhumanist Collective had already solved this issue. All he had to do was to follow its circulation models. The real issue was that both the article and the meridian forging technique assumed he wanted to absorb energy from the atmosphere, but that was the last thing he needed. If anything, he wanted to rid himself of energy, not suck more of it in. Ronin furrowed his brows. What would happen if he switched the channels around? If he flipped them before connecting them to the artifact, would it be possible to push the energy out instead? He organized his new memories into the table he'd created for this. Name: Ronin Maximus. Paradigm: Potentia Panorama. Gates: Great Gates, 0/9. Major Gates, 0/2187. Minor Gates, 4/17,487. Body Strengthening: Calvracian Embrace Volume 1, 12/108. Meridian Forging, 0/N/A. Mind Strengthening: Battle Soul, 13 Personal Guardians, 874 Alien Guardians. Combat Techniques: Near-Death Sight, 4 times per unknown. Enhanced Instincts, Snapshot, Presenceless. Ronin's repertoire was shaping up rather nicely. In addition to the Calvracian Embrace and the Battle Soul, with the Meridian Forging technique, he now had 3 ways to deal with the alien artifact. He exited his mindscape, then walked over to the design studio. If he was going to release energy instead of absorb it, he would need to redesign the diagrams he'd seen in the circulation article. Ronin selected Create New Design. Then, drawing from memory, he added in the diagrams. He next began to modify them. As he would with the electronics in a ship, he altered paths, changed the power source, and switched input channels for output channels, all the while making sure the meridians stayed connected to every organ. As time passed, he finally ended up with a model he thought could work. In total, the model contained about 400 channels, each connecting to a node along the human body. It was all built on 20 large central channels, of which he could begin forging 12 immediately. The last 8 channels were more special, and he would have to wait with those. He leaned back in a stretch. He should probably begin with the meridians in his arms first. "What are you working on?" Simons asked as he walked over. Ronin knew what he was here for. This was about his earlier promise. He awkwardly coughed, swiping away the diagram. "Been doing some power supply rerouting. Didn't you say you wanted it checked?" Technically, he had been rerouting power. "Really? Thanks. I've been waiting for several hours now for a second pair of eyes on this." Ronin spotted a tinge of bitterness in those words. Better help him out right away, he thought, realizing he might have gotten a little too carried away with his research. He pulled up the design of the Alluvian. "We should probably focus more on speed," he said as he saw what Simons had done. "Think of this purely as a racing ship, not a sports ship. Anything that slows it down, unless it's critical, will have to be removed." It was all the critique he could give on such short notice. Simons did a slow nod. "Yeah, I was a little hesitant about that. But now that you put it this way, Hurricane is a top-level pilot. He probably has more than enough ships with cushy seats and whatever else he needs. We did promise him a racing ship, so let's give him one. The two next proceeded to strip down and remove any cable or wire that reduced the ship's speed. There would be no sound dampeners, no heated seats, no roomy walkways, nor speakers to play music. Everything had to go. Then, after a good 5 hours into the project, Ronin eventually received a reply from Liana Furness. He wrinkled his nose in disgust as he read the message. She'd indeed found a few ways to deal with skinwalker injuries, but for the full list, he'd have to pay a whole 15,000 credits. For a job this small, the sum she'd asked for was enormous. With Scrabby's situation being critical, though, he didn't exactly have time to haggle. He transferred over the funds, then got a ping on the implant soon after. The list had arrived. He did a quick surface-level scan of the text before transferring it over to the hospital Scrabby was at. He couldn't make much sense of the list, but this wasn't exactly his field of expertise. All he could do was to wait and hope. The following days became routine. Ronin set aside at least 22 hours each day for the Alluvian, 3 hours in total for the Calvracian embrace and physical exercise, as well as 6 hours for meridian forging. The rest of the time he spent on academy work and sleep. Fortunately, although he still looked sickly, his condition slowly improved over time. Whatever damage Spectre had done to him did not heal like his usual injuries, though. Even after 3 weeks, Ronin still looked sickly. The situation was even worse for Scrabby. In spite of the information he'd sent the hospital, the kid still wasn't showing any signs of improvement. The medical advice he'd provided was probably the only reason the kid was alive. "You've been standing there for almost 5 minutes now. What are you even looking at?" Simons asked. Ronin, currently zoning out in the middle of the design studio with his palm out in the air, turned to Simons. "Can't you see it?" he asked, then turned back to the golden flame flickering back and forth above his palm. Simons gave a slight smile, then shook his head. "You're playing another one of those jokes on me, aren't you? Give it up. I won't fall for it." Apparently, only Ronin could see the flame. Another new observation to note down, he thought. Having completed 2 of the meridians leading from the artifact to his hands, Ronin had been testing out the energy's various effects. For now, this little flame was all he could do. It couldn't burn anything. Heck, it wasn't even visible to normal people by the looks of it. "Whatever," Ronin said. "Let's just finish up the design." He walked up to the interface. By now, most of the modified design had been completed, and what remained were only some minor adjustments. They'd basically thrown out or replaced almost anything that could slow the ship down, then added a xenofuel engine. It was an engine far too powerful for a ship this small. They'd even had to clock it down so the ship wouldn't break apart, and after adding in 2 extra side thrusters, the already mobile Alluvian would become a monster once they finally built it. It should be more than enough for Hurricane to play around with. The biggest challenge with this design had really been the modifications to the ship's internal framework. It was essentially the ship's skeleton, and whether the ship held together or broke apart, it all depended on how strong these frames were. By constructing them using a carbon nanotube-based alloy, Ronin and Simons had reduced the weight of the ship, making it faster. But the material, though light in weight, was not Kangdarium. This had essentially made the internal framework the ship's weakest link, and to deal with this, Ronin and Simons had been forced to get creative. They'd come up with 3 variables to control for. First, a ship's inertial dampeners could insulate its passengers from the resulting G-forces associated with rapid acceleration, but force could not be eliminated, only transferred over to something else. In this case, that meant the ship's internal frames. So the more inertial dampeners they used, the more strain the ship would feel. Second, a heavier ship would have more momentum when moving, and subsequently, experience more strain. So the lighter they could make the alluvion, the less strain it would feel. Finally, by changing the shape and form of the ship's internal frames, they could increase the load they could handle, regardless of which material was used. This all accumulated into their current design, having thick, rounded internal frames, reinforced by secondary frames where possible. Further, their initially Spartan build had gotten even crazier. Over half of the ship was now made out of carbon nanotubes. To make the ship easier to modify by racers, though, Simons and Ronin did retrofit the wiring. The design now made it possible to plug in almost any add-on you could think of. Be it turbo boosters or obnoxiously loud subwoofers, the modified alluvion could take it. And if someone wanted to jury-rig something illegal onto it, there was plenty of infrastructure available for that as well. The added weight would probably crack the hull if you clamped down on the gas, but that wasn't their responsibility. That was on the customer. Ronin and Simon spent a couple hours finalizing the design, then celebrated a job well done with a well-deserved lunch break. "Let me do the printing this time," Simon said eagerly, chomping down on a nutrient bar, its gelatinous texture causing his mouth to smack as he chewed. "Sure, why not?" Ronin chuckled, taking a bite out of his own bar. "By the way, this will be the first real design of our own that we build. After this, we can actually call ourselves designers." "Yeah, but that is only if the ship works. We've changed so many things. We're practically fully reliant on the simulation program now." True," Ronin agreed. "Good thing Harrican agreed to be a test pilot. Let's just hope he doesn't die in the process." "Don't even joke about that," Simons coughed, pointing a finger at him. Finishing their meal, they walked over to the 3D printer, and as Simons turned the machine on, Ronin lined up where the alloy would form. There was something he wanted to test. He knew that although the alien energy didn't seem to interact with the real world, it could. His own body was proof enough of that. "Ronin, which components do we start with?" Simons asked, uncertain. "The carbon nanotube alloy, of course." "All right, some of the components may come out wrong, though. That's expected anyways. Just get going," Ronin replied with finality. Neither of them had made a material like this before, but that only meant this was an excellent time to learn. Simons next made a determined expression, then began to print. Ronin, on the other hand, instead of pulling out a multi-scanner, extended a palm as he began to release energy into the alloy. It's actually working," he thought in shock. Most of the energy just passed right through, but some of it stayed behind as the material cooled. He needed to test this. Staying quiet, he continued to infuse energy into every new component Simons made, alternating between how much he poured in. However, it didn't just end there. After all, if he could lock artifact energy into the material, what would happen if he also used presenceless? As Simons began on a new frame, Ronin visualized the image he used for stealth, locked that image onto the forming alloy, then extended a palm. Soon, his arm began to hurt. He pulled away. Well, that definitely did something. The multi-scanner showed nothing, like with the earlier frames, but he could literally feel the change. He followed the half-finished frame down the conveyor belt, his gaze now inexorably drawn to the component. The hairs along his arms rose and Ronin began to shiver. It was like he was at the precipice of some form of a natural disaster. like an earthquake, already triggered, but not yet arrived. He'd used the image of apocalypse when the four-armed alien died, but still, for a simple piece of alloy to make him react like that. Ronin, what is happening? Simons asked in fear. So, you feel it too? Ronin tore his gaze from the internal frame, then fixed it upon his colleague. Now quivering as he backed away, Simons almost seemed consumed by the object. He was breathing heavily, and his bald head shone from sweat. I should probably melt this down, Ronin remarked to himself. No one would buy a ship made out of this stuff. As Simons kept away at a safe distance, he picked up the frame part, then carried it over to the smelter. The ominous energy it gave off made him feel sick to his stomach. The faster he could get rid of this thing, the better. He placed down the frame, then slammed on the smelter as fast as he could. Seriously, Ronin, please tell me what that was, Simons said. Ronin rubbed his head, then sighed. All right, I guess you deserve to know, but don't tell anybody about this, all right? You have my word, Simons nodded back. It was time to tell him. Let's see. You've already noticed how my body is sort of different from other people's, right? Yes? Well, there's a little more to it than that. I can learn things, unnatural things. My strength is in fact something that I've learned and trained. It can be learned? Simons asked. Then what about me? Is this something I can learn as well? Ronin was reminded of the 2 articles he'd posted, those customer reviews, if he could even call them that. I don't think so, he lied. And you probably wouldn't want that either. The point is that I can learn more than just how to become stronger, and that half-finished frame part I just melted was a part of that. Wait, is that why the company hired you? Is that why you have so much freedom here? No, they still only think I'm a genius, Ronin lied again. So, Simons began, the speed at which you've been learning. What you did during our first academy exercise, was that all because of… Not exactly, Ronin cut him off, but let's forget about that. The important thing here is that I might be able to improve our ships. Simons gave him a knowing look. All right, I won't dig any deeper. But I can see why you've kept quiet about this. Thanks, Ronin said, his lips forming into a frown. Who knows what the government would do if they found out? I really don't want to end up on some dissection table somewhere. With that, they went back to the printer. But whatever relationship they'd had before, it wasn't the same. Not anymore. Simons looked at him differently now, and it showed. He kept glancing over with a weird look on his face, and though Ronin tried to ignore it, he couldn't help but feel he'd exposed too much. You're not making that horrifying thing again, I assume? Simons asked as he began to print. No, don't worry about it. It's definitely not that. Just wait and see. Having confirmed that presenceless worked, there was nothing to stop Ronin from using other mental images. But what image would be best? Toughness and resilience. He knew the answer the moment he asked the question. The lack of strength in the ship's internal framework was the one thing slowing everything down. Ronin next drew upon the strongest memory he had. It was something that had happened 2 years ago. His leg had been broken back then, but to afford food, he'd been forced to work. His manager, maybe out of sadistic spite, had demanded he'd stack metal sheets 4 meters up on a shelf. There had been many of those sheets in that warehouse. Ronin still shuddered when he thought about it. Dragging those sheets up that ladder, time and time again, But he'd done it. It had been the hardest thing he'd ever done, but he'd done it. He closed his eyes, focused as he condensed the experience into a singular mental image, then placed that image inside the forming carbon alloy. He immediately felt that he could hold this image longer. It was nothing compared to what he used for stealth. He held it in place until the frame was done, then used the multi-scanner. "So," Simons cut in, "what did you do?" Hang on. I don't think the scanner is going to be enough." Ronin put on some gloves, then, with a huff, picked up the 200 kilograms heavy alloy. He next shuffled over towards the assembly area, where he used a laser cutter to divide the frame. Scooping up a few dozen pieces, he placed them inside a series of different testing chambers off to the side, then activated the material analysis. For something like this, he would need a true physical test. Instruments began to work within the chambers, and the frame parts were exposed to anything from lasers, drills, shock testers, and pliers to hydraulic compressors. Ronin watched the entire process with rapt attention, all the while receiving updates on his implant. "Simons," he eventually said, "I think we've just hit the jackpot. This. Ronin to this." Simons couldn't speak as he saw the data. From tensile strength to elasticity, the frame parts all showed impossible values. "It's got to be at least 20% above the theoretical max," Ronin thought. He could not only tune up the inertial dampeners now, he could add whatever the hell he wanted onto the ship, and the frames would take it. Their customers could also do their own modifications safely now. But this went far beyond just the Illuvian. He could now make stronger materials than anybody else, and his ships would be able to do things no one else could. He could also make more for less, and he would always have an edge over the competition. "I'll never have to worry about making it as a spaceship designer ever again." This was his gimmick. This was what would draw in customers. And, more importantly than anything else, he could now use the Potentia panorama to help him. The meridian forging technique might not have given him answers to that horrific nightmare 3 weeks back, but it had changed his future. With this, he'd finally made his own path. A better path. A path of creation. The words resonated out like an iron gong inside Ronin's mind. This was what he wanted to do. This was how he would use what he'd been given. "Ronin, please tell me the measurement equipment is working properly," Simons said, his voice having finally returned. "It is." "Do you know what this means?" "I do." Simons wet his lips hesitantly. "If we can make the internal frames this strong, the things we can add, we can pretty much do whatever we want," Ronin finished. His rotund friend couldn't hold it in anymore. "This will be the most amazing racing ship ever. We can even sell it in the professional circuit." Ronin laughed out loud. "It's happening, Simons, and with Hurricane helping us." "Let's build it now!" Simons roared, interrupting him, his whole face turning red from excitement. There was greatness in the air today, and now all they had to do was to bring it out.